everybody. Welcome to this fourth in the series of our Money Rebellion launch talks this week. We are absolutely delighted to have David Gross here, who's been not paying taxes since 2003 as a war tax resistor. We met recently through this conversation about tax disobedience, and I happen to have his book on my shelf, We Won't Pay Tax Resistance, a reader, so I knew this guy knew his stuff, and I am just really excited to hear what you've got to say, David. I know that we're going to get something of the history of tax disobedience and some of the rationale behind it, and also I believe some quite technical points about how to build a tax disobedience movement. Maybe just start by saying that Money Rebellion at the minute is undertaking a calculation of how much of our money is spent funding destruction. So we know that HS2, for example, as a project, is projected to be of order 170 billion. The official figures are 100 billion. And when you add in fossil fuel subsidies, road building programme and so on, there's so much more money being spent by the government on destruction than on what needs to happen. So tax disobedience is clearly, to me at least, an obvious strategy that Money Rebellion needs to be promoting. And let's hear from David about why it's a good thing to do. Over to you, David.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to see if I can get my screen sharing set up correctly here. And I think that's working. So I'm going to be talking about how to build the tactical arsenal of a successful tax resistance campaign. What I want to do is help Money Rebellion succeed and make a tax resistance campaign that has the most impact. And I'll be using the research that I've done into tax resistance campaigns around the world to help illustrate that. So my name is David Gross. I'm a tax resistor from the United States. I've been refusing to pay taxes there since the Iraq invasion in 2003. I also am a scholar of tax resistance. I've been researching and writing about tax resistance for years now, and have over time come up with some ideas about the commonalities between these movements and what makes some movements succeed and some fail. I have a blog called The Picket Line, on which I share the research as I'm researching it. So if you want to see the sort of raw forms, the raw data that I'm working with, I'll share it there as I'm collecting it. If I say anything today about a tactic or a campaign from the past that you want to dig into a little bit more, that would be a good place to start. I have a good subject matter index there, so it's easy to find things about particular campaigns. So tax resistance has been practiced around the world and throughout history in all sorts of different forms, and also with all sorts of different goals in mind. It isn't a one-size-fits-all tactic, but it's also not one that's really only designed for one certain thing. And I'm going to go into that in a little more detail because it's a sort of common misconception about tax resistance that, oh, it's for conscientious objectors like war tax resistors and Quakers. Or, oh, it's for nonviolent resistance for people like Gandhi that are trying to overthrow a government. And those things are true, but the real story is that it's all of those things and more, or any of those things and more. So for my latest book, I went through tax resistance campaigns for the last 2,000 years and from all over the world. And I tried to pick out what are the tactics that these groups used that made certain campaigns more successful than others. I wanted to find out really what makes a tax resistance campaign click, what makes it succeed. So I looked at all varieties of tax resistance that was used in revolutionary forms to overthrow governments, or tax resistance that was used in a more modest way to reform governments or change a government policy, or simple conscientious objection, tax resistance used to become aloof from an immoral government policy. I also examined both nonviolent campaigns that were deliberately nonviolent, or campaigns that just happened to be nonviolent for tactical reasons, and violent campaigns. In the talk today, because Money Rebellion is a nonviolent tax resistance campaign, I'm going to concentrate entirely on nonviolent tactics, but my book covers both. What I'm hoping to get across over the course of this talk are these things. One is that to be successful, you can't just pick a tax resistance tactic and resist taxes and stick with that. You also need to operate on other fronts as well. A successful tax resistance campaign will operate on several fronts simultaneously to make their campaign successful. There are many tactics that can be deployed on each of these fronts, and there are historical examples of how different campaigns have done this. There's a tremendous amount of creativity and experience that we can draw on, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can learn from campaigns that have succeeded before us. And finally, because tax resistance has different sorts of goals, there are different sorts of resistors, depending on what goals they intend to accomplish, what they think their tax resistance is for. And this is less important for some movements where it's kind of obvious everybody is doing it for the same reason, they have the same goals. For other movements, it's a little more tricky. The American war tax resistance movement, for instance, has people from a whole bunch of different categories with different goals. And I have a feeling that Money Rebellion might be in the same boat. So that's the first thing I'm going to talk about. The four major varieties of tax resistance that I've identified are these. One is conscientious objection, where you don't pay taxes because you don't want to be complicit with what the government spends those taxes on. There's civil disobedience, in which you use tax resistance as a way of amplifying your protest. There's nonviolent conflict, in which you're using your tax resistance as a form of political force. And then there's legal assertion, which is you're using tax resistance as sort of a test case because you believe the tax is illegal or that there's a legal way to go about refusing to pay it. These different varieties of resistor have different goals in mind. And because they have different goals in mind, different tactics will be appropriate to different ones. And so it isn't the case where all tactics of tax resistance will be appropriate to all campaigns. It really depends on what you expect your tax resistance to accomplish or what you hope for it to accomplish. If you have multiple varieties of resistor in your campaign, there may be disagreement about this. So which variety is Money Rebellion? It's not easy to tell, at least superficially. It may be that you're more than one category, and it's probably worth time to figure that out because that will make a difference in the tactics you choose. So I'll go over these in a little more detail. If I'm a conscientious objector, and that's why I want to be a Money Rebellion tax resistor, the thing that's important to me is that my money, which represents my effort, doesn't go towards the climate catastrophe. It doesn't go towards the subsidies that the government gives to the fossil fuel industry, for instance. I want all of my effort, all of my resources to be put on the side of my values and not on the government's values. And so a conscientious objector, it may not matter as much whether their tax resistance is part of a large movement or even whether the government notices that they're resisting. The important thing is that they aren't personally contributing to the awful stuff. To someone who's resisting from a motive of civil disobedience, on the other hand, it's very important that the government notice. It's very important that they make a big splash. Tax resistance to them is a sort of putting an exclamation mark at the end of their protest. It's saying, not only do I feel strongly about this, but I feel so strongly that I'm willing to break the law. I'm willing to face the consequences for that. Someone who's resisting from a motive of nonviolent conflict wants to use tax resistance as a form of pressure on the government or a form of political force. The idea being that if you withhold taxes from the government, you're withholding resources from the government, you're making the government weaker, you're making it more difficult for the government to do the rotten things that it wants to do. So to somebody who's practicing nonviolent conflict, and that's the reason why they're doing tax resistance, they're mostly going to be interested in tactics that take away the most resources from the government and also that bring in the most people to help them, because the more people who do it, the more resources are going to be able to keep, and the more pressure they'll put on the government. Someone who's asserting a legal right often will be looking for the perfect test case that they can bring through the judicial system in order to declare that the tax is illegal, or that it's not being applied correctly, or doesn't apply to the people it's currently targeting. Or, for instance, in this case, I've got a quote here from Pete Brace in his letter to Revenue, saying that there's a conflict, he feels, between paying taxes on the one hand. He feels the law obligates him to pay taxes, but on the other hand, the law also obligates him not to contribute to the loss of life, damage to property, damage to human rights, and damage to nature that would be involved in helping the government do its climate policy. And so given this conflict, he says to Revenue, I don't know how to proceed. On the one hand, I'm legally obligated to pay tax. On the other hand, I'm legally obligated not to. And so he's asserting basically a legal right not to resist, or to resist, not to pay taxes. So where do you stand? Have you been able to look at these four varieties and say, oh, I know exactly which one I'm at? Sometimes it's easy. Sometimes you're like, oh, I know, I'm a conscientious objector. That totally speaks to me. Other times it's not so clear. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You might change your focus over time. You might start out as a conscientious objector and then decide really you're a nonviolent resistor. Or it's possible to combine more than one of these into a coherent mode of resistance. They can overlap. You can be a nonviolent resistor and also want to make your tax resistance part of a large protest, for instance. But there's good ways and bad ways to go about this. And I've seen both. So here's an example of somebody doing this coherently. I'm using a war tax resistor as an example here. So this war tax resistor resists because I'm unwilling to be complicit in war. And this is a conscientious objection style motive. On the other hand, he hopes to convince many people to take this stand. And so I'm very public about it. I'm willing to risk government retribution by doing things that make my resistance more confrontational. So this is a civil disobedient protest motive. Furthermore, I hope that if enough people join me in this, we'll reorganize society in a less violent way. So he has aspirations that have more of a nonviolent resistance component to them. But that's okay. All of this is compatible. You can find tactics that speak to all three of these things without any conflict. But I also see people sometimes doing a kind of cargo cult mix and match, where they'll grab tactics and motives and things in a way that isn't compatible. And here's an example of that. My conscience will not allow me to contribute to killing in any way, so I withhold 20 euros from my income tax bill and send that money to the Ministry of Education. If enough of us do this, one day maybe the schools will have all the money they need, and the military will have to hold a bake sale if it wants to buy a tank. Now, the problem with this is that the motive, which is a conscientious objection motive, doesn't explain the tactic that's being chosen. If you're conscientiously objecting to paying for war in any way, then withholding a symbolic value from your tax return isn't really going to help that very much, because you're still paying for war with the rest of your taxes. And furthermore, withholding some token value from your tax return isn't going to force the military to hold a bake sale to buy a tank. So it's just not going to work. And so this has disadvantages in terms of, for one thing, you're not really going to meet your goals. For the other thing, you're not very convincing, and that from the outside, other people can look at how you're explaining your tactics, how you're explaining your goals, and realize that it doesn't really add up. So you're not very persuasive to others. Here's another thing that is a divide in the American war tax resistance movement, and I expect you'll probably also find this in Money Rebellion, and that is between people who think that the government is basically a force for good, even though right now it's not operating very well, and that the important thing for the climate action movement is to reform the government, get it on our side, and get it to start working energetically to help address the climate crisis. And then there are people on the other side who say, you know, the government is always and always has been a tool of the people who are just relentlessly after profit. And we're not going to be able to turn it to our side. It's always going to be against us. And so what we need to do is we need to weaken the government, make it less strong so it can do less harm, and start building alternative structures to replace it. And this will affect strongly how you decide on your tactics. If everybody's on one side or everybody's on the other side, it's easy. if you have people that are split between these two camps, some tactics are going to seem good to one side and not to the other, and vice versa. And some ways of selling those tactics are going to seem either offensive or inoffensive, depending on which side of the gap you're on. So if you have people in your campaign from both of these camps, make sure that you keep that in mind when you evaluate your tactics, and also when you are trying to explain to people how to resist and why they should be resisting. Make sure you're not alienating people on one side or the other of this equation. These different resistors, people in different categories, will evaluate a tactic differently, and here's an example. This is a case from the American War Tax Resistance Movement. This is somebody who had decided as their tax protest, they were going to pay their taxes, but they were going to pay it in a strange way. Rather than writing a single check for $5,500, they were going to write 5,500 checks for $1 each. And on each check, they were going to write the name of a victim of war in the memo field, a different victim. Now, to somebody who is trying to amplify a protest or make a media splash or something like that, a civilly disobedient protester, a tactic like this is going to look appealing. This is really creative. It's a good angle to get media coverage. It makes a connection between taxes and war by using these names of the war victims. So in that sense, it's very successful and very useful. And if that is your goal in your tax resistance, this is going to look like a good tactic. If your goal for tax resistance is conscientious objection, on the other hand, it may look kind of silly, because it doesn't really matter whether you pay your taxes in one check or 5,000 checks. You're still paying for war. You still have blood on your hands. To somebody who's resisting from a motive of nonviolent resistance, they may think, well, if it costs more for the government to process all those checks than they get from the money that they get out of it, maybe this tactic could work. It could help more people resist because there's less risk involved. So with all of these tactics that I'm going to be presenting today, some groups are going to find them useful. Some groups may find them silly or even counterproductive. And so it's useful to find out which sorts of people, which sorts of resistors are part of money rebellion when you choose your tactics, and imagine yourself in each of those positions, evaluating the tactic to see if it makes sense. The tactics that I've categorized or cataloged, I've put into these 5 categories. And in my opinion, a successful tax resistance campaign will be one that chooses tactics from each of these categories: supporting the resistors who are currently resisting, bringing new resistors in, anticipating and frustrating the government's countermeasures, developing new and deploying new techniques of resistance, of tax resistance, as the campaign proceeds, and also tactics of education and public relations. And I'm going to go into each of these in a little more detail, and also give some examples of how historical campaigns have deployed each of these sorts of tactics. And the first one I'll talk about is supporting the existing tax resistors. This, of course, is extremely important because these are the heart of your movement, the people who are currently resisting, the people who were the first to take the plunge. And it's important to make sure that they know that you've got their back, that they've got the support that they need, that they're not going to feel abandoned or feel like they're going to drop out because they've lost the plot or they don't know if people are still with them. So I've come up with dozens of techniques that people have used over the years to make this happen. I'm going to talk about 4 of them in particular. The first one is developing mutual aid plans for legal expenses or penalties. The theory here is that the government will often respond to a tax resistance campaign not by taking reprisals against all the resistors, but by picking out 2 or 3 and really coming down on them like a ton of bricks. And the theory behind that is if they do that, it'll scare off the rest of them. So they'll find an organizer, or they'll find somebody with celebrity name recognition, and they'll just really come down on them. What mutual insurance does is it spreads out the burden of those reprisals, so it doesn't all fall on one person, but it gets spread out over the entire movement. This makes it less frightening for people to start resisting, It's a way of increasing the solidarity and togetherness expressed by the people in the movement. And it also allows people who, for whatever reason, can't resist themselves to contribute to the resistance of other people and become sort of part of the movement that way. Most of the time, mutual insurance is used to defend against government reprisals, but I've also seen cases where people come together and they contribute as a group to a common fund to launch assertive legal challenges. So either challenging government reprisal methods or challenging the tax itself. So it can work on the offensive as well. I'll give an example of how this works in the United States in the war tax resistance movement. There's something called the War Tax Resisters Penalty Fund. It's been operating since the 1980s. It's very effective. There's a link at the bottom of this slide, and maybe somebody could copy that into the chat room, or feel free to visit it right now on your own. That gives a little more detail about how the fund works, but I'll give you an overview right now. So in the war tax resistance movement, a war tax resistor may file their tax return and refuse to pay the taxes that are owed on it as a way of protesting against war. The way the government will try to respond to this is to seize the money somehow from the resistor, either from their bank account or from their salary. And when they do this, they will add penalties and interest to the amount that wasn't paid. And this is their way of discouraging people from resisting. If you resist, not only will we eventually get the taxes from you, but we'll also claw back some penalties and interest, so it'll even be worse. And this is their way of discouraging folks. So if this happens to a resistor, they could send news of the seizure to the War Tax Resisters Penalty Fund. The War Tax Resisters Penalty Fund then takes the amount of the seizure that is attributable to penalties and interest and divides that number among the subscribers to the fund. And then it sends out a postcard or an email to all those subscribers of the fund saying, hey, could you chip in this much money so we can give it back to the resistor and reimburse them for the penalties and interest? Those subscribers send back their small amounts. The War Tax Resisters Penalty Fund combines that into the full amount, gives that to the original resistor, and as a result, the resistor doesn't lose any more from having the money seized from them than they would have lost if they had just paid their taxes originally. So the entire amount of penalties and interest gets recovered for the resistor. And what this means is the entire deterrent effect that the government expected to get from adding those penalties and interest isn't there anymore. There's no economic penalty for resisting anymore. And it makes it much easier for people to work up the courage to become war tax resistors. Another way to support resistors is to come together in collectives, communes, co-housing, co-ops, things of that nature. A lot of the theory behind this is that when the government taxes us, it's usually a tax on some sort of transaction. So there's a customs duty when a good crosses the border, or there are value-added taxes as goods come through the supply chain, sales taxes at the point of sale, income taxes. All of these things have to do with transactions, economic transactions. And if you can remove more of the things you do in your life from the realm of the money economy, then you can reduce the amount that the government taxes from you. So in other words, if you're not, here would be an example. If I'm in a co-housing situation, if I had been paying somebody to take care of my children, then that would be income to the child care center. It would be salaries to the people who are taking care of the children, and those would both be new opportunities for the government to tax. If, on the other hand, I'm in a co-housing situation and I take care of the kids on Monday, somebody else takes care of the kids on Tuesday, it's more of a barter arrangement. There's no money changing hands, and there's fewer opportunities for the government to reach in and take some money out. Other examples are to help resistors if the government seizes their property or the government shuts off their utilities, and that's something that's becoming more common in recent years. An example of the former would be in the first Intifada in Beit Zahur. The whole town was resisting taxes that were being paid to the Israeli military occupation. The Israeli military blockaded the town and started taking reprisals in the form of seizing property, seizing the tools that small manufacturers were using. And the town stuck together, and they displayed a lot of solidarity in the face of that. So if somebody had their refrigerator taken, for instance, by the government, neighboring families would help that family store their food. And because these reprisals triggered solidarity instead of triggering fear, it really backfired on the occupation. Something that's becoming common now is for governments to, rather than raise taxes in an overt way, they will hide taxes among things like utility bills. So if the government has a utility monopoly, they will just hike the utility bills. This also, in a place like Greece, where property tax evasion and income tax evasion are really strong, utility bills are a little harder to evade. And so the governments will use that as a way of having a more reliable income source. It's also very regressive, however, and so people resent it for that reason, and also just in a lot of cases, in Greece, for instance, because of the economic situation, a lot of people were not able to afford the hikes on their electricity bills, and so either couldn't or wouldn't pay the bills. Well, the government, of course, responded by shutting off the electricity to these homes. And the Won't Pay movement, the tax resistance movement in Greece, responded to this by sending guerrilla electricians to come in and reconnect the power in these households. Sometimes they would do this accompanied by film crews. So they would interview the family and talk about their hardships, and they would also film the electricians reconnecting the power, both as a way of sort of showing off kind of like battle footage, I guess, and also as a way of spreading the news about how to go about this so that other people could also reconnect the power if they needed to. The second category of tactics I want to talk about are those tactics that bring new resistors into the movement. In general, your movement is going to be more likely to succeed the more people come in and start resisting. You make more of a splash, you're able to resist more money. And so things that bring in new people to resist are very helpful. And these are some examples of categories of tactics that I've come up with, of ways that people historically have done that. And again, I'm going to talk about a few of these in a little more detail with some examples. The first of these will be to choose a low risk, perhaps symbolic, high participation tax to resist. I'll give examples of all of these. So in the war tax resistance movement in the United States, we commonly will resist the federal income tax, because it's a little easier here for us to get in the way of the income tax and interrupt it. In Denmark, it's entirely pay as you earn, and there's very little way for somebody who is a salaried employee to stop the withholding of tax from their salary. So they needed to come up with something else. And so war tax resistors there chose the television license tax instead, because it was a way that more people could participate. In the United States, the phone tax was used, particularly during the Vietnam War and shortly after, as a tax that more people could resist. They could resist more frequently because that tax was something that showed up on their telephone bill every month. It was also a small tax. It amounted to probably less than $1 on most people's bills every month. And this had a couple of advantages. One was that people didn't feel it was particularly risky to resist. And also, it was not cost effective for the government to go after any resistors. After a while, thousands and thousands of people were resisting this way, and the government felt like it did have to go after some resistors just in order to keep it from getting out of hand. But it never became a cost effective thing to do. It was also a tax that was historically connected with war. So it was a tax that was first raised during the Spanish-American War. It was reinstated during the Vietnam War, so it had a symbolic value. Another example of a symbolic tax would be the salt tax in India. When Gandhi started his salt march, the press at the time frequently ridiculed him because the tax was so small. It looked like he was making a big deal out of just a few pennies. But he knew it was symbolically important, and the Raj knew it was symbolically important. They knew that if they let him get away with it, it would just be the first of other taxes that he would resist. And so they, at one point, hired hundreds of people to go to the beach where Gandhi was going to end up on his salt march to destroy by shoveling under the tax deposits that were there naturally on the shore, hundreds of people to do this, just basically to ruin his photo op, because they knew how symbolically important this was, that the Raj would prevent Indians from harvesting Indian salt on Indian soil for their own use, was so ridiculous and was such evidence of tyranny that this worked out extremely well symbolically, even though the amount was small. Another way to bring in new resistors to your movement is to use the technique of saying, well, let's resist all together once enough of us have signed a pledge that we're going to resist together. So nobody has to resist right away, but you resist once everybody is committed to resist together. This is sometimes called conditional commitment. So here's an example of the way such a pledge might be written. And in theory, this becomes a way to make it easier for people to resist by making it less frightening, because you know other people are going to be joining you. You know you're going to be together with a lot of people you resist. You're not going to be sticking your neck out. You're not probably going to be the first person the government targets when it decides to go after people. And also, you're more likely to feel it's going to be effective. If you think you're only going to be one of 5 or 6 people resisting, you may think it's not worth the bother. But if you know you're going to be one of 10,000 to 100,000 people resisting, you think, well, that's probably going to make a difference. I want to be part of that. In practice, I have seen a number of campaigns try conditional commitment pledges like this, and I've seen more of them fail than succeed. They do sometimes succeed, but they often don't. Part of the problem is that your trigger number of how many people have to sign the pledge before you resist has to be high enough to be impressive in order for this to work, but low enough that you're actually going to meet it. And it can be hard to know ahead of time how to find that target number. So here's an example of one that didn't work. There's an anti-war group in the United States called Code Pink. And during the height of the Iraq War, they decided to launch a pledge like this. If we enlist 100,000 pledge takers by April 5th, they said, we're going to engage in mass civil disobedience by withholding the taxes that pay for the war in Iraq. They had a flashy website, a really easy to use sign-on form. And when people signed on, they could insert a comment about why they were signing on. So you kept seeing this list scrolling by of people's names and the reasons why they were signing on. It was very inspirational. And in the early days of the campaign, they got a lot of support. A lot of people signed on. And it looked like it was going great guns, but then it lost momentum. They didn't, as it turned out, have the capability as an organization to get to that 100,000 pledge taker level. It was an aspiration, it was a hope, but they didn't really have what it took to actually make that happen. And so as the low-hanging fruit signed up for the forum, the excited early adopters signed up for the forum, it started to slow down to a trickle. And so by the end, only about 2,000 people signed, and they were so discouraged by this that they just sort of quietly dropped the program, and it didn't end up going anywhere. So my recommendations to you, if you're going to do a conditional commitment thing, are to add some things to the tactic. For one thing, when people sign on to the pledge, stay in regular contact with them, and also give them alternative ways to resist while you're waiting to get that pledge number. Also, depending on what method of tax resistance you're going to use when that trigger condition is met, there may be things that people who sign up can be doing to prepare for that ahead of time. For example, in the United States, if you're going to be resisting the income tax, you usually resist in April when you file your tax return for the previous year, and then you owe money and you don't pay it. But most people who file their taxes in April don't owe any money at all. In fact, most people who file in April, the government owes them money because they've had too much withheld from their paycheck over the course of the year. So if you want to resist in April, you have to start sometime in the middle of the previous year reducing what gets withheld from your paycheck so that you have something to resist in April. So if I was going to be creating a pledge like this for income tax resistors in the United States, I would make sure to say, sign the pledge now, but stop your withholding now as well. And then you can decide in April whether you want to resist or not. Another thing I would recommend is to think really carefully about that trigger number that you use for deciding when that pledge goes into effect. Don't just throw out a number that sounds good or that would be impressive, but ask, do we really have the institutional capability to find that many people? Do we know, have we surveyed our potential audience of campaigners to see how many people would be willing to sign a pledge like that? If we did get that number, do we have the organizational capability to organize that many people to do resistance, or would we have to build that over the course of the pledge? And if so, how would we do it? Give it some thought. You might also consider whether to set up a date, like a date timeline for when the pledge must be fulfilled or not. This gives you the ability to, fail fast is the buzzword they're using now. But rather than just let the pledge trickle on, you're not sure whether you're going to meet that pledge number or not, you have a cutoff date where you say, okay, this didn't work, let's move on to something else. Which brings me to the last point, which is have a plan B. So if you don't reach that pledge amount, make sure, now that you've got this nice collection of people who have signed the pledge who are at least interested in doing this sort of thing, make sure to have a plan B, where maybe you go back to the pledgers and say, okay, we didn't get the amount we were hoping to get, but let's all get together as a group and decide what we can do with the numbers that we do have. Another way to bring new resistors into your movement, or in particular, to take people who are already in your movement or are sympathetic to it and turn them into tax resistors as well as whatever else they're doing, is to use social pressure. So, for example, Quaker meetings, this is less the case now, but it used to be the case that Quaker meetings had war tax resistance as one of their points of orthodoxy. In other words, to be a Quaker in good standing meant that you were not paying taxes for war. And they enforced this by, if they found out that somebody was paying their taxes, or if somebody suspiciously was not reporting to the meeting that the government was going after them for not paying taxes, they would send a delegation to them and say, so what's going on here? Why aren't you with the program? And if they confessed and said, well, I'm just paying taxes because I don't see anything wrong with it, or in some other way, we're trying to get out of the sacrifice that the discipline demanded, they would essentially sell that Quaker that they needed to recant and get with the program or be disowned, which was sort of the Quaker process of excommunication. And if you were disowned, you couldn't come back and become part of the Quaker meeting again until you stood up and apologized for what you had done and promised that you were going to get with the program again. Now, this would seem perhaps kind of extreme, but I could see a time when in the climate change activist movement, you say, if you're really committed to this, if you really think this is important, then you need to be a tax resistor as well. If you're still paying all your taxes to the government that is using this to destroy the climate, you might as well be driving a gas guzzler. You might as well, be taking your private plane around the world. It's that bad. Maybe you're not there yet, but this is something you might aspire to. During the Bardoli tax strike in India in 1928, this was a property tax strike in an agricultural district. And the way they enforced this is that the people who lived there said, if you're a property owner and you continue to pay taxes to the government during our tax strike, we're not going to rent land from you. We are not going to help you cart your goods to market. We're not going to help you harvest your produce. We're not going to sell you things in our stores. So basically telling the landowners, you can have land in our district, you can pay taxes if you want, but your land isn't going to be worth anything to you anymore because we're not going to help you work it. So you can use social pressure in this way to make your tax resistance stronger. And I'll also talk about this a little bit in the next section about frustrating the government's countermeasures. Because among the ways you can stop the government either from taxing or from taking reprisals against resistors is to use the same sort of social pressure against people who are in the tax office. So for instance, during the Roman occupation of Palestine, this was a tactic that was used by Jews in Palestine. They made social pariahs out of anybody who collaborated with the Roman occupation as a tax collector. And this was sort of the Roman standard procedure. They would go into an area that they occupied and then recruit people from the local population to join their tax bureaucracy, to take some pressure off of the Romans and make it so they didn't have to import their own personnel. Well, the way that this worked out in Palestine was that the tax collectors that they were able to get from the local Jewish population became pariahs, not only socially, but also religiously. They couldn't testify in Jewish courts. You became unclean if you ate with a tax collector. And what this meant was that the Roman occupation had to either pay these people a lot more in order to overcome these sacrifices that they would have to make, or they would have to get their tax collectors from the dregs of society, people who were already kind of scummy and didn't have anything to lose, which reduced the prestige of the local tax administration and also increased the motivation for the local population to resist. Another way to frustrate tax enforcement is to try to get people in the tax offices to resign their offices or to sabotage in some way. During the first Intifada, the Israelis took a page right out of the Roman occupation book, where when they were occupying Palestine, they were hiring people from the Palestinian population to become part of the tax office and collaborate in the Israeli tax collection. Well, during the first Intifada, they quit. They just quit en masse. And so as a result, Israel had a very difficult time extracting taxes from the Palestinian people that were under occupation. Sometimes you can find unusual collaborations between people in the tax office and the tax resistors. So this happened in Greece during the recent economic crisis there, where you had people from the Won't Pay movement on the one hand protesting the government and resisting their taxation. Well, occasionally they were on the barricades right next to people from the tax offices who were resisting the fact that austerity measures were causing government benefits to fall, government salaries to fall. We had a kind of similar thing happen in California. I was at a protest during the tax filing season at the post office in Oakland with a bunch of war tax resistors. We were all holding signs about how people should stop paying taxes for war. And all of a sudden these vans showed up with a bunch of Treasury employees who had just come from a union meeting, and they'd come down to the post office to protest as well, but they didn't bring enough signs. So they took some of our signs, and we had this surreal experience of people from the Internal Revenue Service marching right alongside of us with signs asking people to stop paying taxes for war. So you never know when you're going to find strange allies within the tax office. A common way to frustrate tax enforcement is to destroy the apparatus of taxation. So any sort of material that is involved or important to tax enforcement or tax collection. One example is the cameras that are set up in a lot of municipalities to take pictures of driver's license or license plates on cars and send out tickets automatically to people who are speeding or running traffic lights, breaking the law in some way. I don't know if this is happening the same way everywhere. It's certainly happening in the United States where the municipalities are setting these cameras up not as a safety measure. In fact, sometimes safety gets worse after they set up the cameras, but mostly as a revenue measure to try to extract more money from drivers who are driving through their area. Well, this of course causes a lot of resentment. And here's an example of how some people fought back. Around Christmas time, they dressed up as Santa Claus and went around and put brightly colored gift boxes over the top of the cameras. And it kind of looked like a civic Christmas display, but the effect of it was to make the cameras inoperable for the time that they were covered up. This is also a tactic that's been going on all over the place for years now. During the Rebecca riots in Wales, resistors destroyed over 100 toll gates. French revolutionaries went directly at the tax offices and tried to destroy as much of the apparatus of taxation as they could find there. The Bonnets Rouges recently destroyed the highway tax portals that the government had set up, and in this way helped to force the government to rescind that tax. Another way to frustrate tax enforcement is to use paperwork. The great love and also the great vulnerability of bureaucracies everywhere. An example of how this was done in the American war tax resistance movement was a resistor named Karl Meyer, who in 1984 decided as a tactic he would file a different tax return every day. And so he sent in a new return every day. Each return showed that he owed taxes, and each return was accompanied without a check, without the taxes. And so this meant the government had to go into another routine of going over his return and filing his return, and also sending him letters telling him that he was the subject of an enforcement action. In this case, they also gave him a fine for every return that he filed. And I think he'd racked up about $175,000 in fines by the end of the year. The IRS, I think, only managed to get about $1,000 from him by seizing his car at one point. And he still owes that money today and still hasn't paid it. During the poll tax resistance campaign, one of the early forms of the resistance before people had started mass refusal was something called the Send It Back campaign, where people who were required to register for the tax by law went ahead and filled out their registration form. But on the registration form, there were a number of opportunities to check boxes or fill out extra things to say, I have a question about this, or I'm not quite sure how to fill this out, or I need help with this section. And so they would make sure to fill in all of those. And so the government ended up being inundated with all of this paperwork that it then needed to do additional processing on, usually by hand, usually involving making phone calls, and it was completely unprepared. It did not have the personnel to do this. It didn't have the time to do this. And so this really ended up gumming up the works. The next set of categories I want to talk about are ones that involve deploying new ways of resisting taxes. And there are a few reasons why this is helpful and sometimes important. One is simply that the more ways you can resist, the more money you can keep away from the government. So if keeping more money away from the government is part of your strategy, if, for instance, you're a nonviolent conflict style resistor, then this can be helpful for that reason. Secondly, if the government comes up with a way of frustrating one of your varieties of resistance, it comes up with a good set of countermeasures that are sufficiently discouraging, it can help for you to have something else in reserve that people can switch to. Another reason why it's helpful is that there may be some tax resistance methods that are attractive, but only certain people can do them. So if the tax doesn't apply to everybody, for instance, or if some people for some reason are unable to resist, you're going to limit the number of people who can actually resist. Whereas if you deploy some new techniques, you can thereby bring in a larger set of people who can resist. So I've come up with many ways that people can do this. The first three involve, they're kind of similar in that they involve trying to target things that the government is able to tax or makes money off of, and come up with ways of circumventing that. I'll talk about those first. So one is simply to boycott anything that the government is taxing in a large amount, or things that are government monopolies, where any purchase of them, the profit of that goes to the government. So this involves you doing a little research, for one thing. Where does the government get its money? And then which of those things are things that individual consumers can target? And then figuring out how to go about organizing a boycott to stop that flow of money to the government. This was very common among American Quaker war tax resistors, who were very conscientious about trying to track where their money was going and whether any of it was going to war. So if the government put a tax on postage stamps, for instance, and that tax was going to go to pay for war expenses, a Quaker might stop sending letters, for instance. You can extend this tactic to boycott entire countries. And this was famously done in the divestment campaign against South Africa, for instance. There's another similar campaign targeting the Israeli occupation of Palestine. This was a signature tactic of the independence movements in India and in the United States. And I can see this being a useful tactic for Extinction Rebellion in finding a country that is dragging its heels on meeting climate targets, or in signing climate treaties, for instance, and deciding to boycott the entire country. Another alternative to boycotts would be to manufacture and sell alternatives to the products that the government either has a monopoly on or taxes highly. So this was another tactic of the American Revolution and also the Indian independence movement, was to not only boycott the products of the British occupation, but also to manufacture alternatives to those to make it easier for the boycott to happen, or to replace goods that otherwise they were basically required for living, like you have to wear clothes, right? So the American patriots would have spinning bees where they would get together and spin the thread and weave the cloth and sew the clothes. And they would throw parties at which, it was kind of de rigueur to be wearing homespun cloth. And of course, this was also a signature tactic of the Indian independence movement. The spinning wheel is an icon of that movement. Back when I was a big beer drinker, I used to make my own beer at home, in part to avoid the 5 cent tax on 5 cent per bottle tax that the federal government puts on beer. An alternative to manufacturing and selling things is to just evade the tax collector entirely by smuggling. And this can be particularly useful for things like the sales tax and the value-added tax. The chaos of Brexit and the Irish border may give an opportunity to use smuggling as a way of circumventing taxes. If your movement is a nonviolent resistance movement, if you have aspirations of replacing the government or strongly weakening it, then smuggling networks can end up being important to your movement for other reasons. They are also networks through which communications can flow, through which refugees can flow. So there are multiple reasons why smuggling can be helpful. Strikes of all sorts can help amplify a tax resistance campaign. Again, this is because the government typically will tax during transactions. And so strikes that stop transactions from happening also stop the taxes from happening. Strikes can also be a way of holding off government reprisals. There's an example of this from the Household Tax Resistance Campaign in Ireland several years back, where the Civil and Public Service Union said, if the government tries to withhold taxes from the salaries of any of the members of our union who resist, we're going to go on strike. So it was a way of trying to force the government not to take its measures of reprisals. A general strike in Benares, India, in 1810 meant that tens of thousands of people left town, locked their doors, shuttered their businesses, and went and they camped in a field outside of town by the house of the British administrator there. They stayed there for a month. News accounts of the strike at the time said that the solidarity was so extreme that even the very thieves had stopped robbing people. Even they weren't using their regular funeral rites, but just throwing people into the river, throwing bodies into the river. Like everything had come to a standstill, and they stayed there for a month, and eventually their demands were won. And this was very inspirational to Gandhi, who used similar techniques in the tax resistance campaigns that he used as part of the Indian independence movement later. Another variety of resistance techniques is to pay your taxes, but pay them in an inconvenient or symbolic way. This can be helpful in part because it's not illegal. So people who are afraid of doing something against the law will be less hesitant to do a tactic of this sort. I'd mentioned earlier the case of Evan Reeves, who paid his taxes in individual checks for $1 with a war victim written in the memo field. Here's another example of a tax resistor who made out a legal check that her bank would honor, but wrote it on a gigantic coffin lid as a way of making the connection between war and taxes. These are both symbolic, but there are also times in which you can pay taxes legally, but in a way that is so inconvenient that it ends up costing the government. And here's a good example of that. During the Hong Kong Yellow Umbrella protests a few years back, somebody there created an application that allowed people to pay their taxes $1 at a time rather than all at once. So just divide your tax money out into $1 amounts and submit those dollars via the payment processor to the government. Now, the government went ahead and logged all of those dollars as being paid. But the thing is that the payment processor was charging the government $1 for each transaction it processed. So instead of that money going to the government, it all went to the transaction processor. So it was a way of legally paying taxes without any of that money going to the government. So occasionally, if you're clever enough and you do enough research, you can find little tricks like this to be a tax resistor and a taxpayer at the same time. Another tax resistance tactic is to secede or establish a parallel government. And that might seem extreme or out of your reach, but bear with me here. The sort of dictionary definition of this, or the poster child for this, might be the Zapatista movement, which created an autonomous region in Mexico, kicked out the government tax collectors, stopped paying taxes, and started building their own structures. But you don't necessarily need to have an autonomous region or be able to kick out the government in order to do this. An example of that would be the Indignados movement in Spain, which came just before the Occupy movement, was one of the inspirations to the Occupy movement. It was very similar to it. It encouraged people there and brought in war tax resistors to help explain the techniques and tactics. But encourage resistors there to withhold their taxes from the government and redirect those taxes instead to the popular assemblies that the Indignados movement was based on. And then from those assemblies, together by consensus, come up with projects that would be funded by those redirected taxes. So what they were doing essentially was building a parallel state or building a parallel alternative to the state that would start doing things that the state should be doing, or doing them better than the state was currently doing them. The final category of tactics I want to talk about are those of education and public relations. So for education, you need to make sure that everybody who is thinking about resisting or that you think might be able to join your movement knows how to do it and knows what the repercussions are, what the consequences are, and how to ameliorate any of the negative consequences, and knows what resources are available to them over the course of resistance. Public relations are just sort of the standard propaganda, making sure that you have a good impression amongst the general public about what you're doing, make sure everybody knows why you're doing what you're doing and why it's important. And I'll talk about a few of the categories of tactics and give you some examples. The first one is going to be redirecting taxes to charity, which is very important in particular in the American war tax resistance movement. The way that critics of tax resistance will sort of as a knee-jerk, in a knee-jerk fashion go after tax resistors, the first thing they say is, well, you're just keeping it for yourself. You're just a tax evader who doesn't want to pay for things that are important to society. And so you're just being selfish. By redirecting taxes, taking them from the government and giving them to charity, it's a way of diffusing, among other things, it's a way of diffusing this criticism. It's also a way of creating ties between your tax resistance movement and other groups. So there are other groups that are doing good things in society. By giving your money to them and making sure that they know that the reason you're giving your money to them is you're keeping it from the government as part of a tax resistance campaign, this helps you build a bond between your tax resistance campaign and these other various groups and helps build a larger grassroots movement. So for instance, in the United States, war tax resistance groups will frequently hold what they call granting ceremonies, where they will come together and multiple resistors will pool their money and then give it to a number of different organizations. There's an organization in the Bay Area called the People's Life Fund that holds these ceremonies around tax filing time every year, which also creates a good angle for the news media. They invite people from these various organizations that are going to be giving money to the ceremony. The representatives from these organizations each have a chance to stand up and talk a little bit about the work they do. And this not only makes connections between the war tax resistors and these various groups in the community, but also between those groups themselves who may not have been aware of each other and the work that they do. And so it helps build a larger grassroots ecosystem and helps to nurture it and help it thrive with not only money, but also communication. You can also redirect money back directly into the movement that you're resisting for. So you might redirect the money that you're doing through Money Rebellion back into the activities of Extinction Rebellion. And war tax resistors have done this as well, taking the money that they're resisting in war taxes and giving it to, for instance, draft resistors. Another way of doing this is to pay into escrow accounts. And in this case, what you're doing is not redirecting the taxes to a third-party charity, but you're holding it back from the government and saying, we will give this money to the government at some time in the future when the government meets a certain condition. So we're willing to pay our taxes, we'll pay our complete taxes, but we're not going to pay them now. We're going to wait until the government meets a climate target or signs a treaty or comes up with an enforcement mechanism to make sure that it meets the climate target. You come up with some condition. Now, this has a couple of there are a couple of reasons why this is very helpful. One is that it, in the same way as redirection does, it demonstrates that you're not just keeping the money for yourself. And the other is it gives the government some financial incentive to pay attention. Like, here's this money that we're holding back. It's money that you could be spending as part of your budget, but we're not going to give it to you until you meet certain conditions. And they say, well, what are those conditions? They all of a sudden become interested and perhaps able to meet the requirements that they haven't met so far. Another helpful technique is to use surveys. And this was particularly helpful in the poll tax resistance movement, as I'll talk about in a moment. It has multiple purposes. One is you can survey the public to figure out how many of them are curious about tax resistance, interested, willing. Also, how many are supporting you, even if they're not willing to do it themselves. This sort of door-to-door, face-to-face, person-to-person survey is a very useful way of not only getting information coming into your movement about tactics and techniques and public support, but also it can be helpful in getting information out to the general public. People are much more likely to listen to somebody face-to-face than they are to listen to a broadsheet that they were handed or something that's broadcast on a channel that's outside of their bubble. So for instance, in the poll tax resistance campaign, they used this great technique. They went around to every household in a neighborhood and distributed these signs that said no poll tax here, instructions on the back saying put this in your front window if you're part of our campaign. Well, then they could go around on a second pass and see which households had put those signs in the window. And they knew that those people were the ones that were most likely to go further in their resistance or go further in their support for the resistance. And so they could visit those households individually and say, hey, would you like to be part of a local network? Or would you like to be somebody who is a bailiff watcher? Or they could try to recruit them into various roles in the movement. And it became much more efficient to go around to the households that way. It's very clever. And it was also a way that resonated. I don't even know if they were aware of this at the time, but the same tactic was used in the tax resistance campaign for the Reform Act of 1832, where these signs were distributed saying no poll tax paid here that people put in their windows. And that brings me to my next category, which is to resonate with myths, legends, folklore, or historical examples. This has been important in lots of campaigns. So the Women's Tax Resistance League in the UK, about 100 years ago, they were trying to get women's suffrage through tax resistance. And so why do they have this man from the 17th century on their banner? Well, this is John Hampden, and he's a tax resistance hero of English history. And so they were trying to compare what they were doing with somebody who was already recognized as a hero for his tax resistance. And so this was their way of saying, you know, we're in this same tradition. We're not in opposition to democracy and government. We are trying to improve it. We're trying to make it better. We're trying to move the ball forward. Every American tax resistance campaign eventually compares itself to the Boston Tea Party. The Bonnets Rouges in France, the reason why they had those red caps on their heads, they were referring back to a tax resistance campaign at the time of Louis XIV. So all of these resonances help you sort of build an immediate positive image for your campaign from the start. Thatcher tried to call the poll tax the community charge because it sounded so innocent, but her opponents made sure that the name poll tax stuck, and it did stick. And this is in part because this harkened back to the Watt-Tyler revolt back in the day, which, you know, it's something from the history books, but it came up again and again in the course of the poll tax resistance movement. People kept referring to it. They kept having signs and posters and things that referred back to the Watt-Tyler rebellion. And this made them think, you know, hey, we're part of something that has historical resonance that reminds us of our heroes, you know, of our Robin Hoods and our John Hamptons and our Watt-Tylers. Another way to build public support for your resistance campaign is to take public oaths, to go public, to put your name out there and say, I'm resisting. This was very important during the American war tax resistance movement in the Vietnam War, for instance, when advertisements were put in the newspapers with names that people recognized, names of celebrities, names of famous authors, people that people could identify with. And what this did is it made war tax resistance much more mainstream in the anti-war movement at that time. And people could look at these names and say, well, if all these people are resisting, what's stopping me from resisting too? And also, probably in the back of their minds, if all these famous people are resisting, the IRS isn't going to come after me. They're probably going to go after one of them when they decide to start cracking down. And the final set of tactics I want to talk about are things that involve wearing badges, insignia, ribbons, particularly uniforms, things of that nature, so that you're broadcasting your resistance to those around you with what you're wearing. So the homespun cloth of the Indian independence movement is a good example, and the Gandhi caps, which were made out of those cloths. It was not only a way of, you know, participating in the resistance by wearing homespun cloth and boycotting British fabric, but was also a way of broadcasting to everybody around you. It's no accident that I'm wearing these clothes. I'm wearing these clothes because I'm part of the resistance. More recently, the Gilets Jaunes, the yellow vest movement in France, they were able to use these yellow safety vests to great effect in order to display solidarity, amplify the impact of the numbers that they brought to their protest in their successful tax resistance campaign. In the Women's Tax Resistance League, any tax resistor who had gone to prison for their resistance, and there were a few, was awarded a pin. Here's an example of it, a picture of the pin that they were awarded, that they could wear at suffrage events. And by wearing this pin, they were sort of given a place of honor at the events. And this, I think, became not only a way of showing respect for these people and honoring them, and a way that they could demonstrate their pride in the resistance that they had done, but I think it probably also triggered some envy in other people who were resisting. Like, I wish I were that hardcore. I wish I was able to go to prison for this cause. And so I think it probably helped boost the movement for that reason. Okay, that's a lot of tactics. And I presented these not because I thought that all of these tactics would be appropriate for Money Rebellion, but I wanted this to be a sort of inspirational brainstorming way of looking at the variety of tactics that are available to you. There are lots of ways to resist and lots of ways to amplify your resistance. And I hope this will inspire you to come up with good ideas of your own. So in conclusion, what I'd like you to take away from this, one is that the historical and global experiences of tax resistors have a lot of lessons they can teach us about how we can make our resistance more effective and how Money Rebellion can make its tax resistance succeed. You need to prepare to battle on many fronts in order to have the most chance of success. So don't just pick a tax resistance campaign. Make sure you have ways to support resistors, bring new resistors in, frustrate government countermeasures, have methods of PR and education. Also, the more tactics you're aware of, the more examples from history you can draw on, the more tools you have to win these battles on these many fronts. And finally, remember that there are all these varieties of tax resistor, and people use tax resistance for different reasons. They have distinct goals. So keep that in mind when you choose your tactics. I have a lot more information about all of these campaigns and all of these tactics available on my website and also in my book. That's what this book is all about, is trying to come up with ways to help tax resistance campaigns succeed by showing them the lessons of these various campaigns. You can go to the website of my book, and it has some free workshop materials you can download as PDFs that take you step by step through the process of picking out tactics that are going to be appropriate and most useful to your movement. And that's that. Back to you, Gail.
Thank you, David. I'm blown away, actually. We can't really do clapping, but I'm clapping very strongly for that talk. I really, really enjoyed it. I've no doubt you know of Gene Sharp's writings on civil resistance, and I just feel like I've got Gene Sharp's favourite grandson or son who focuses on the tax element. So what an honour to have such an in-depth presentation, which has given loads of food for thought. And I mean, partly I just want to sit here and talk tactics, and maybe we will as well, but there's a number of questions around. I mean, I suppose a sort of really obvious one in a way is just how has this been for you personally, your own tax resistance? Yeah, I mean, I'd say you seem like a happy person, obviously maybe you're just having a good day or whatever, but I think there's something about when people stand in their integrity that shows in their soul. But what's been the highs and lows for you as a tax resistor?
It's pretty much all been highs, very few lows. In the United States, we are, as tax resistors, at a kind of lucky point right now, in that the government is kind of increasingly inept, and the tax administration in particular is underfunded and has a lack of personnel. And so as a result, resistors like myself are not being targeted like perhaps we used to 30 or 40 years ago. And so I've had the great experience of having years that I have refused to pay slowly tick away off the statute of limitations and then disappear entirely. And then being able to redirect the money that I hadn't paid to the government to charity, which always is a fantastic feeling. And I know that the charities I give it to are going to be doing so much better work with that money than the government would have. And so it gives me a very good feeling. Also, we're in the war tax resistance movement. It's a very friendly movement. We have people from all of these categories that I'd mentioned of resistor. And so we all have different ideas in mind of how we're resisting. And there seems to be a different method of resistance for every resistor, but we all get along well. And so that's nice. And that probably contributes to the smile on my face as well.
Thank you. I'm having a bit of internet difficulties here, so I did hear what you said. We've got a similar situation in the UK actually, where the tax office, the PCS union, have been complaining about how their ability to function has been eradicated, and actually PCS union have been a big supporter of tax justice in the world. And I perhaps would like to talk to that topic a little bit, about you made that really clear early on. I thought it was really helpful slide, the slide about, do you think that we're trying to reform governments here, or do you think that they're beyond redemption and we have to replace them and so on? And I think there'll be a variety of views across XR activists, but I would guess there'd be more in the sort of reform model. I mean, for myself, I don't see it really as an either or, more a sort of both and. We're very much in terms of promoting citizens' assemblies, for example, which would, as we call, upgrade democracy. So I guess I think quite a bit about evolutionary change as well. To what extent do you see tax as being a useful tool in this society? yeah.
Well, I have personal views about that, in that I tend to have more of an anarchist viewpoint and don't think that coercive taxation is a very good idea for that reason. But I also recognize that this is a minority viewpoint, and that it's certainly not something that is required of tax resistance to be a useful tactic, and that it could be useful for people who think that that states are important and that taxation is important, just as much as it can be for those of us crazy radicals on the fringe. The reason why this is a division that plays out and is kind of important is I've seen campaigns. I'll give one example, would be the Israeli independence campaign. So it used tax resistance, and it used a nonviolent conflict and sometimes violent conflict version of tax resistance to try to break the hold of British Palestine. And what happened was, after Israel had won that battle and started its own state, people were already kind of used to treating the tax administration with disdain and resisting it. And Israel had a hard time getting its own tax authority off the ground because of this. And so it turned out to some extent that the tactics they'd chosen during the resistance didn't work out well for them after they had won the battle. Now, if you're trying to win the battle, maybe you're not thinking that far ahead, but it's possible that thinking that far ahead will be useful to you. So you might need to think, is this tactic weakening the government that I'm later going to need to be a strong government in order to meet some of my goals? And if so, you may need to rethink those sorts of tactics.
I'm again, the internet went quite flaky there. It seems to be this time of night, actually. I've asked my kids to get offline, but I did get the gist of what you're saying. I mean, some of the things that some environmental campaigners would campaign for, in Exile We Don't Take policy, we don't get behind any one particular policy, but would be like carbon taxes and the sort of general concept of repricing goods. So Richard Murphy, who's a tax campaigner in the UK, would talk about the 5 R's of taxation that has this important role to redistribute wealth, to reprice goods. So if it's a harmful good, you internalize the cost, to reorganize the economy by spending into the economy, and to bring in revenue and so on, raise representation as the other. He's got these 5 R's anyway, so that means that bring people behind democracy. And I guess the way I see it would be that there are plenty of rich people who are doing their damnedest to evade taxes and do put their money where they feel it should be spent. So it might be the opera, or it might be Tory party donations or whatever. And there's something in that kind of tradition where just this idea that there's not a collective concept of how we should budget and spend together. So is there a third way around participatory budgeting and participatory taxation, where you make a collective choice and you go with a collective rather than sort of that very individualistic approach that goes, I'm not into this, I'm into that, so I'm going to redistribute. I'm sort of really into the integrity behind that, but anyway, I sort of made a bit of a speech there, but if you've got anything to add, otherwise I'll go to some other questions.
Well, the examples that I gave of the Indignados movement in Spain, for instance, or of the granting ceremonies that are done by war tax resistors are kind of examples of that. In the United States, certainly, I don't know all the details about many other countries, but in the United States, it's very easy the bar is low for coming up with ways of spending your own money in a way that's superior to the way that the government spends the money, because so much of what our government spends on is just making the world worse. And so it doesn't take a lot of study, or you don't have to be a policy genius to come up with a way to spend your taxes better than the government's going to do it. Doing it as a group through something like a People's Assembly or granting ceremony or something like that, gives a certain amount of extra democratic legitimacy. It isn't just your own personal whim. And it also means that, I guess, the wisdom of the crowds can
I
play into it a bit.
I'm guessing the culture's different in the UK because, like, the thing that across the political spectrum, to an extent at least, that people prize is our National Health Service. That's, you know, the biggest example of it's not really talked about like this, but like a socialist project, you know, that people chip in, and it makes the health service, I think, half of what it costs in the States. Anyway, let me not grab all the space and go to some of these questions. There's a lot here. So people are sort of asking for your sort of favourite tax resistance and what first inspired you to get to do something.
I was mostly inspired by the American War Tax Resistance Movement, and in particular Henry David Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience. I read that as the Iraq invasion was impending. And as I read it, I realized, oh my God, Thoreau's right. I have to stop paying taxes. I can't support this any longer. So he was the inspiration that got me into this in the first place. As far as my favorite tax resistance campaign, one of my favorites has got to be the Rebecca riots in Wales. And this was an exciting and fun and weird movement. So you had men dressed in women's clothes on horseback at night, running around Wales, destroying toll gates and toll booths. And it's such a weirdly picturesque movement. And you imagine yourself at night with feathers in your hair and your face all painted up and dressed in drag and on horseback with your axe in your hand, running around the countryside. There's just something very cinematic, I guess, about it. So that's the one I tend to think of when I think about my favorite.
Thank you. And we've got a few questions asking about effective taxes that can be withheld in the UK, because I don't know how much you know about the UK tax system, so it may not be fair to ask you too much about this, but I've been looking into it over the years. It's actually quite hard not to pay tax in the UK. I tried to invent not paying VAT in a cafe as a sort of more symbolic act one time, but things like the TV license wouldn't be, I don't think, seen as a government tax really. It would be seen as a thing for the BBC and so on. And with the utilities bill, although it has a percentage tax on it, I've asked a utility provider, and they would, if you just withheld that bit, it would be that you hadn't paid your utility bill. It wouldn't be seen as, wouldn't impact the tax office. And then we have pay as you earn, PAYE. So it's just the most obvious one is sort of council tax is easier not to pay, but the logic of non-payment is less clear. I did wonder in the Denmark example with the TV license if the logic was clear to people, and also, you know, people are asking of other ideas for how to other ways that people might be able to withhold taxes. But as I say, you may not know the UK situation.
Yeah, I can't speak to that myself, but I would definitely recommend that become a topic of discussion amongst the people who are organizing Money Rebellion. And I'd also recommend that you reach out to Conscience, which is a group that has organized war tax resistors in the UK. And so they probably have a lot more understanding of the process and the tactics involved in resisting taxes on the ground in that particular legal situation.
Yeah, thank you. And just to sort of reassure people listening, we have had a communication with Conscience. It was some time ago, but they did have a list of things that you might not think about. But it's there are moments when you have to pay to register birth deaths, or you know, they had a sort of whole list of ideas of times when money's going to governments that you might not have thought about. You know, I'm hoping that in all the social media streams that people are sharing our form. So maybe it's a good moment to let David know a little bit more about our tactics and our approach here. The form we have for Money Rebellion, because I've thought a lot about these things, you know, is it about debt? Is it about taxes? Which tax? What, blah, blah, blah. because, as you've lined out, there are different types of people out there. We've basically got a form to try and capture them all. Probably not all of them, but it's like asking people if they would do something if one person joined them, 5, 10, 10,000, so and my colleague Roger, who's done quite a lot of research in mobilizing around civil disobedience, his strong view is that you have to do it in waves. So you have demonstrator projects. So you have the people that are the conscientious objectors, they lead the charge because they're just fucked off and they're doing it anyway. And then, so that might just be half a dozen people. And then there'll be some backfiring, there'll be some publicity, and then more people join in. So that's the kind of theory. Who knows? I think with Extinction Rebellion, so many to work, and they did, and then you just keep trying things, and who knows really. Okay, let me just find another. So just to say to people who are listening in that way, I really hope if you're going to form, there's something that you feel that you can participate in, whether it's tax debt, small loans, or joining the team, helping us get this thing organised and so on. As David said, sometimes you can't do that. So here's one. Our political economy aggressively propagandizes the illusion that it's monolithic and unshakable, when COVID showed us just how unstable it is and how our own lives would be threatened to protect it. What would you say to those people who have been socialized to believe we are powerless against it?
Wow. One of the first things I'd say, of course, would be the self-interested one. Read my book. You see a lot of examples of people who have successfully risen up at the grassroots level and have had maybe what seemed like unreasonable demands at the time, but worked together and accomplished those goals. History has plenty of examples of people demonstrating their power. Against what would seem like crazy odds. You have governments that were exercising much more dictatorial control and had much less chaos to try to control than they do now. And people were still able to rise up and make things happen. So certainly it's way too early to give up hope.
Thank you. And what would you say to people who criticise tax resistance as trying to take down the government or the economy when it's already struggling due to COVID? I think I had that question asked to me on 5 Live today, folks, by the way.
Well, it depends on what kind of tax resistance you're doing, right? Because there are some versions of tax resistance that really are trying to sabotage the economy, that really are trying to bring down the government. When the people trying to get the Reform Act of 1832 passed, refused their taxes and then did a run on the bank, they were really trying to collapse the Bank of England and force the government's hand. And so that sort of criticism would be valid against them if indeed it is a criticism. So if you're clear about the tactics that you're choosing, you can say, we're not trying to sabotage the economy. We're trying to repair the economy. We're taking the money that we were giving to the government, which was doing things that sabotage the economy, and we're instead giving it to these projects or these campaigns that are actually making things better for people, making better for the economy. If you can make sure that that message is out there, and this again is part of the public relations and education tactics, then that will help diffuse that sort of criticism.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I said something similar today as well, is that, COVID is part of the crisis. This is the whole point, is that we're not prepared for crises. The taxes aren't being spent in that way. There's a tax justice report that just came out, I think this week, that said that tax dodging by sort of rich and corporation amounts to over 500 billion of lost taxes for governments across the world, and it's the equivalent of a nurse's salary every second. So I think one of the things that we've when you were talking earlier on, David, about the kind of legal side of things, another aspect that we've thought about in Money Rebellion is that it's possible that they would, and they have done this to some organisers in in Extinction Rebellion is to come forward with some kind of conspiracy charges. You're conspiring to defraud the tax office. And I mean, the piece where you said do this as a strategic process, I know of two people that have done that in the UK. A guy called Pedro, and his I don't know if you've seen this, his communication with HMRC is really amusing and making some good points about it's illegal to pay taxes. And there was another guy who was making that point. Sorry if you're watching, I've actually forgotten your name right this second in the heat at the moment, but a war tax resistor. My sense though is that the sort of HMRC, our tax office, kind of laughs about it. They don't really take it seriously, and it doesn't really get daylight on it. I think XR's got more chance of doing that because of we're building off the back of a bigger social movement. But what I was going to say is that that point at which they potentially come after us to say by organising a tax strike, you're attempting to defraud the tax office or whatever. And like you say, all these other ideas about escrow accounts would prove otherwise. But it would just be a beautiful moment from my point of view as a tax justice campaign. And it was like, really, because, the people may not know this, the UK is the biggest organiser of corruption services across the world. So there's something called the Financial Secrecy Index and from the Tax Justice Network. And they measure all the, it's very detailed indices that looks at how you organise tax dodging, so that both evasion and avoidance across the world. So the UK, with its crown dependencies and overseas territories, is the number one organiser, and it's basically a form of neocolonialism in terms of how it extracts resources and wealth from the global south. So bring it on. Don't want to accuse of us fraud, really. Let's have that day in court. I don't know if you've got anything to say in response. Again, I just sharing some of the thinking behind this, that we were running on multiple fronts, really. We don't know which bit's going to stick, so we're kind of running a number of tactics at the same time.
Yeah, I can't speak to the legal situation in the UK. I just don't have enough experience with that. I know in the US, the war tax resistance movement itself has never really been targeted. I don't think it's been a very attractive target for the government to try to do any sort of conspiracy sorts of things. And I also note that during the poll tax resistance campaign, I don't think there were any cases where the government tried to bring charges against an organization. They went after individuals. And they certainly had their hands full trying to do that. But I don't remember a case where they ever tried to go after an organization and use conspiracy charges or something along those lines to try to shut it down. Having legal advisors to both avoid those sorts of charges or to make the most of them, and as you suggested, use them as a way of highlighting other cases in which there's tax injustice, might be a useful thing to start thinking about now, starting to build that expertise.
Yeah. And we've got those contacts with the tax justice movement. As I said, it's 427 billion that's being avoided and evaded, and it's something like 32 trillion that's held offshore, and that's not including the Picassos and all the rest of it. So, I think we're just about through. There's a number of questions here, but some of them are sort of similar to others. So I think we've probably good. And so I just want to really appreciate you again, David, for such a thorough and clear walkthrough why we need to do this. I'm going to be cheeky and ask, but I think you're willing to offer us sounding boards for ideas that we have, or
Yeah, please let me know. And I'm very eager to, sort of be listening and watching as the campaign develops and see how it works. I'll give advice where my advice is wanted. Otherwise, I'm going to be a student and pay close attention to how you proceed. And I'm rooting for your success.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that there is so much in XR that's about doing it anyway, whether you think you're going to succeed or not. And in that way, you can't lose, because there's something of the integrity and the conscientious protection in this as well. That's about knowing that you did the right thing. And I think that, we've just launched Money Rebellion this week. We've already started this process of getting this bigger conversation about the political economy out there, folks. And that's just by merely the idea that the threat of this movement taking on tax disobedience and debt disobedience is, I think, really a big threat to sort of establishment political economics. So join us, please, in whatever way you feel you can. And I think we're just going to roll with the Money Rebellion video now.
Money Rebellion. There's a set of rules around money, and they're barely visible. They govern all our lives, our wages, our healthcare, our homes, our food, our opportunities, the health of the planet we live on, the future we leave our kids. We are told following those rules is in our best interest. No, it's not. We are told there is no alternative. Yes, there is. Money Rebellion is a rejection of this economic system. It's time to change the insane rules that are killing us. We want to live. Join us.